the Northwest home for paranormal, you're listening to U.S. Phenomenon with your host, Mario Magana.
From the Pacific Northwest in the shadow of the 1962 World's Fair, the Space Needle. This is U.S. Phenomenon. I'm your host, Mario Magana, where we explore the extraordinary and the unexplained. In this episode, we are stepping into the time machine to go back to 1979 to talk about the Greensboro massacre with our guest tonight, Aran Shetterly, who is a writer, editor, and narrative historian known for his deep dive into historical events and cultural phenomenons. He is an author of the critically acclaimed book like The Americano Fight with Castro for Cuba's freedom, and his latest work, Morningside, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre, the struggle for an American city's soul. Shetterly is rich and has a huge background in media, and having founded and edited Inside Mexico, the most widely distributed English language periodical in Mexico. It is my pleasure to welcome to U.S. Phenomenon, Aran Shetterly. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Mario. Thanks for having me on.
You know, it's interesting with everything that's been going on in politics, and I thought this might be a good time to talk about some history pieces and what got you started on this whole piece. And I know that not a lot of people talk about this, but let's talk about what got you started in this whole, what got you started talking or even doing the research about this event that went down in 1979 in Greensboro.
Two things. In 2015, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina with my father, who's a painter, and he had a show of paintings at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. And the woman who organized that said, there are two people you need to meet. And so we went to this little cafe, and I met Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wife, Joyce Johnson. There was just a picture of Nelson Johnson there, in fact. And he has been an activist in North Carolina. There's Nelson Johnson being arrested by the police on November 3rd, 1979. In Greensboro since the mid-60s. And he told us the story of this November 3rd, 1979 event. And I couldn't believe I'd never heard of it. I thought, wow, how is it possible that something this significant has completely escaped my attention? I want to know more about it. And then I went away. I was actually still living in Mexico at that time. We moved back to the United States. And in 2017, where we moved was Charlottesville, Virginia. And if you remember the August 11th and 12th Unite the Right rally that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, a very similar clash where a woman who was counter-protesting against a right-wing demonstration there was killed. And all of a sudden, I remembered what I heard about in Greensboro, and I thought, wow, I think a way to understand what had just happened in Charlottesville would be to go back and understand better what happened in Greensboro.
For most of the younger kids who are probably not great at history, you would think that this may have gone lost in time. And I can't believe that, even thinking that for this type of situation to go down, people to be arrested. Can you, for those who have zero inclinations of the event at all, don't know, they're just walking into this show, this radio pod, maybe they're listening via podcast. If you're listening on a terrestrial radio station, let's give the Cliff Notes version of this story to the average listener.
So here's the story. It's the late 1970s. It's a time not dissimilar from our current moment, where there's a lot of uneasiness and insecurity. There's high inflation. People are feeling economically insecure. They are feeling politically uncertain. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, there's a group of organizers and activists who are trying to build multiracial unions in the textile mills there, which are still some of the biggest textile mills in the whole world. And they're having trouble organizing across race. And so they decide to have a march to explain how Black and white workers need to work together in order to make better demands of management. And they're going to have a march through Greensboro, and then have a conference at the end of that march to sort of have a deeper discussion. They expect this might be the largest labor march in North Carolina since the 1930s. There might be that many people there. And as they're setting up in the morning, a caravan of Klansmen and neo-Nazis suddenly drives up to the site of the point where the march is going to start from, pick a fight, start shooting, and in 88 seconds, 5 of these organizers are left dead, another 10 are injured. Now, that's just the beginning of the story.
What's wild to me is when you say this, someone who's listening, if you're listening right now, this happened in 1979, not the 60s or the 50s, 1979. For those who are listening this evening and we're like, wait, when was this? This was just like 45 years ago.
Exactly 45 years ago. And even more, Mario, to that point, there were 3 trials after this, all happened in the 80s. And no one was ever held criminally responsible for those murders.
That's wild to me, that to think that life was extinguished. And I go back to think that everyone, like, regardless on what side of the aisle you might be, and I know some of this is very extreme, but there's a lane for everybody. And I know that I don't like to take rights away from anybody. And I just, in these types of situations, even like right now within the whole, the Gaza Strip and, the Palestinians and the Israelis fighting over some land over which, I mean, is very complicated to talk about. Look, people don't need to die over religion. People don't need to die over beliefs. People need to, it blows my mind when you think about these types of things. So I'll get off my soapbox, but yes, go ahead, continue.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that, of course, played a huge role in what the outcome of this was that this was the middle of the depth of the Cold War. I mean, and so right. Communists were the enemy, and this group of organizers in Greensboro were part of a larger organization that had organizing groups in different cities around the country. And they had called themselves the Workers' Viewpoint Organization until 2 weeks before this event. And they changed their name to the Communist Workers' Party. Now, this was a group, they didn't have any foreign connections. They weren't, tools of the Soviet Union or China, but they were a homegrown group that believed that in order to really change the structures in this country to be more fair to poor and marginalized people, for deeper equality, if you will, they needed to have some sort of revolution. Now, that revolution wasn't happening on November 3rd, 1979. That was a march. Right. And that revolution was at some undefined point in the future. And it would take a lot of organizing to get there. But, they were radical and also, pushing the limits of what Americans could tolerate in the Cold War, ideologically.
And this during the time and in an economic time, and I, excuse my ignorance, this was at the end of Carter's administration, right? Was that the election year?
It was right before the election year, but that plays into it. One of the reasons we've never heard about this is the very next day that the hostages were taken in the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. So this is when the Ayatollah came into power, kicked out the Shah of Iran, and when the United States wouldn't return the Shah for justice in Iran, they took hostages in the U.S. embassy. That had triggered, what had happened in Iran had triggered another oil crisis. And so there were gas lines, there were inflation, they were calling it, stagflation and price spurts. And inflation was, 17%, way higher than what we've dealt with in this moment.
And this was also the time when they were doing the gas, like you would have to, if you're registered, it was like, I don't recall, but I know that during the gas times, which I think everyone had a beast of a vehicle back in the day. If you were to get gas, it was on on certain days you were allowed to get gas. I mean, to think and to fathom that now in 2024, I mean, you're talking like this place could be crazy times.
Not only that, the governor of North Carolina asked people in North Carolina not to drive above 55 miles an hour. They had to get gas, on odd number or even number days. And he asked them to keep their thermostats at home at 65 or below.
Wow. I mean, I can't even imagine keeping my place at 65 below. I mean, yeah. I like it comfortable. Even in the studio, it's nice in here, but I'm like, still, it's like to think that what happened and what they were doing to conserve. And it just is interesting. And the movement that you think about on how that was such a radical thing going on during that time, but to see or to hear even to now about something that clearly the Klan was not happy with and said, look, we're coming at, it's brutality. I mean, it just blows my mind on what actually transpired on that day.
There had been a few months earlier, the Klan was having a recruiting session in a town about 70 miles from Greensboro, in which they were going to show this movie called Birth to the Nation, which was made in 1915 and is this famous cinematic achievement, but also very racist. And the Black community in that town didn't know what to do. They wanted to prevent it, but they weren't sure how. And Nelson Johnson and some of the other Communist Workers' Party members came down there and organized a march in which they marched right up to the community center in that town where the Klan was and had this face-off with the Klan. There were police there, and that's the only reason probably there wasn't terrible violence that day, because the Klansmen and Nazis there were armed with all sorts of weapons. And the Communist Workers' Party folks thought this was a victory, that they had forced the Klan back inside, they disrupted their event, and the Klan, said at that moment, we'll get revenge. But it's more complicated than that, Mario, because there was a police informant involved in this who, when asked if he could find out what the Klan was going to do in response to the November 3rd march, he went down and told a room full of 80 Klansmen that it was their patriotic duty to come to Greensboro and confront the communists.
It's interesting when you think about all this and like looking at the video. If you haven't had a chance to go to my website or to watch the stream, you can do so by going to onairmario.com to watch all the visuals. Make sure you're a subscriber to the podcast. Go to your favorite podcasting platform and just search U.S. Phenomenon with Mario Magana. Our guest this evening, Aran Shetterly, wrote a book about the massacre from 1979. Let's go back in time to when you first started to do your research on this situation. Was this something that you were, when you look back now, were you like, oh yeah, this is something that it intrigued you? What was the biggest piece to you that that just spoke to your heart when you're like, wow, more people need to know about this? And what made you want to write a book about it?
A couple of things. One is, I was grew up in the 70s, and I wanted to know more about this time that I'd grown up with. I'd grown up in rural Maine. I wasn't anywhere close to Greensboro or events like this. And right. I thought, wow, there was a lot going on when I was a kid that I had no idea about. So that was part of it. The other part of it, though, was when I started to sort of poke around in Greensboro, was to see how powerful the narratives around this event still were, the degree to which it still divided that city. And, I was on the phone with a former mayor of Greensboro who started yelling at me that this was a waste of time and I shouldn't be looking into this. And, why was I doing it? And I had other similar encounters like that, and as a journalist and historian, when someone's that angry about me looking at something, it makes me want to look at it more, of course. I also had been so impressed with the humanity of Nelson Johnson and his wife Joyce that I thought these seem to be pretty special people. I want to understand how it is that they could have become communists, how it is that, they survived the trauma of an event like this where they lost 5 of their close friends, and how they had worked to try to actually bring some reckoning for this and reconciliation around this in Greensboro. So, there were a whole bunch of questions that I came to this with.
And when we talk about Communist Party or the communist movement, I mean, most people think of like you said earlier, most people think of like the former Soviet Union. They think of that. And the word is in most of those who grew up 70s, 60s, 70s, the Gen Xers, the baby boomers, really know that word to be a very evil word. I mean, the 60s as well. I know that when you talk about the Fidel Castro movement, you talk about, the assassination attempt on, or the attempt on the assassination against Kennedy, and them taking Oswald and him being a part of this movement, or, how he had his own situation going on. That word just seems to be such an evil word in American history.
Totally. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to take this on, was to sort of explore the humanity behind that word and see what it really meant in this case. And, and the other thing is, what's interesting to me is, J. Edgar Hoover, let's just talk about J. Edgar Hoover for a minute, led the FBI for 48 years. And he did so much to make us have that visceral feeling to that word communism, right? I mean, that was part of his project, was to make us terrified of what that word meant. And the thing is that he was calling people communists who weren't communists because they advocated for equal rights for Black people. And so the word gets used in our political society and our culture in so many different ways. And so I thought, I want to know who these people really are and what they really stand for, because so often we get to that word and we just stop, as you say, and it's like a wall.
It really is. I mean, you're right. Because when you start to talk about some of the stuff, when you go back in history and you listen to J. Edgar Hoover talk, I do recall him in a lot of things, a lot of political things during that time were used in, just as you referenced. And it blows my mind to think that they would use that word to be extreme. Now communists would be liberal. I believe they may use that word, like tie that into that piece, where instead of using liberal back then, they use communist. That's how I look at it.
It was interesting to see in this presidential campaign that just happened, Trump calling Kamala Harris Comrade Kamala, as right, and using that. And I thought, is that landing? I mean, is that having any impact right now? I mean, are we still scared of that? And it occurred to me as I was thinking about it that he may have been making sort of a sly reference to race as much as to politics.
And do you feel, I mean, doing this book, watching the election, and now your comment here in regards to, calling Kamala Comrade Kamala, do you feel like this country is more racist now than it ever has been? Or do you feel like the country was in the closet racist, and then after the 2016 election, everyone just showed up to play, you know?
You know, I think there are a lot of things going on. Race is part of it. And so I'll address your question directly, but I think there are other pieces to this. And one of the things that intrigued me about the Communist Workers' Party is they weren't focused only on race. They were focused on class, and they were focused on, rights for poor people of all colors, white, black, brown, whatever. And so I think that I just want to be careful of over determining with
Sure.
race. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
saying that's the root of everything when I don't necessarily think it always is the root of everything. But to your point, I mean, there's no question there is a racist history, there are racist institutions. And what happens to me, and one of the things that I noticed doing this book is when leaders call it out and empower it, it becomes worse. And when leaders don't do that, we can act a little better, but it's been empowered right now. It's been whistled to the foreground as opposed to kept in the background.
It's interesting when you were talking about the conversations and starting to put the book together in regards to resistance, you being a Caucasian male. Is it that people were afraid of what some would call revisionist history because it's not I don't know that you're not rewriting history. Clearly, I think that you are documenting, or you're taking from what transcribed, what actually happened, and narrating in a book without a bias of any flavor. From my understanding, that you were just trying to strictly stick to the facts, and you were getting some resistance because, let's be honest, it's not pretty in American history. Those types of things that's ugly. I mean, we're the home of the free and the brave, and to me, it seems like you were getting some resistance.
Well, I got some resistance for sure. I think it's you have the Klan on one hand, right, with their idea of a white ethno-state, essentially, right? And
Sure,
we can talk about that. You have some people who wanted to upset the whole system and the order, the American system and establishment in order to create something new. But then you have sort of the Greensboro business and political class that wants a place that is stable, good for business. It's a company town, right? And so stirring that pot doesn't serve the interests, to their mind, of creating an image of a progressive Southern state where everyone gets along, or progressive Southern city where everyone gets along, that is a place you should bring your Fortune 500 company to. And so I think some of the resistance, comes from telling stories that are uncomfortable and making people think, that happened there? Well, but yeah, I mean, this project took me 7 years, Mario, because there were hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. There were 3 trials. It was one of the 3 largest FBI investigations at the time in American history. And so the amount of material to sort of study and try to process was overwhelming. And I have over 1,000 footnotes in this book because I tried to play it straight down the line in that sense.
Our guest tonight, Aran Shetterly, who has a book available. You can find it on his website, which we have linked in the podcast. If you're not a podcast subscriber, if you're listening and driving, don't write this down, but you go back and subscribe to the podcast, or go to aranshetterly.com to purchase his book. And you have multiple books out there. Obviously, we talked about that. When you're going through these documents in the 7-year in the making project, did you find something in there, a nugget that you would say, wow, I had no clue that this was a good or bad or indifferent, something that you learned other than what you kind of had an overview of, but what was something in your research during your these 7 years, what was something that you took away that you were like, damn, I didn't know about that?
Yeah, there were a lot of things. So, first of all, I want to say just sort of how I tried to tell this story was more like a novel. It's through characters. And there were some wonderful characters to mine, in addition to the Johnsons, who I've mentioned. The informant Klansman, Eddie Dawson, is a fascinating character to me. The FBI agent who led the Greensboro investigation, a man named Cecil Moses, spent hours and hours talking with me about his worldview and what he remembered and how it came to pass. So I really tried to leave no stone unturned. But here's a couple things. One is, a lot of people have heard of what happened at Kent State in 1970, when some National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 Vietnam War protesters. And this was, an American tragedy. What people don't know is that the year before, in 1969, on the campus of North Carolina State A&T, North Carolina A&T, the African American, the historically Black university in Greensboro, a confrontation led to the largest military action on an American campus in our history. 650 National Guardsmen, helicopters dropping tear gas, arresting hundreds of students. I mean, it's this remarkable thing. And, what I came to understand is I couldn't understand what happened in 1979 without understanding what had happened in 1969, and how, in a sense, the sides in Greensboro had been defined at that time, including with Nelson Johnson, who was part of that history in 1969. So that was one thing that blew my mind. I didn't know about this huge, uprising. Another thing, though, was I learned a lot about FBI history that people haven't looked at. And this is sort of, J. Edgar Hoover dies in 1972. Watergate happens, the scandals around Nixon right after that, in which the FBI is sort of implicated in helping Nixon and also helps push Nixon out of office. And then there's something called the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church from Idaho, which goes into illegal activities in the FBI and CIA. This is why we know about, for example, the assassination attempts on Castro by the CIA, is because of the Church Committee. And the FBI, which had been, the most trusted institution in America under Hoover, all of a sudden people don't trust it. The morale is low. Agents are leaving, and they're trying to regain their footing. And what I ended up learning was what happened in Greensboro had a lot to do with what the FBI wanted to do, which was regain its footing, regain its authority as a law enforcement institution. And they were using what happened in Greensboro to do that, and they ultimately succeeded in reestablishing themselves.
I'm trying to remember if was Herbert Walker Bush the director of the FBI then, or was it later?
No, it was a guy named William Webster.
Okay.
Judge Webster was in 1979. And right before that had been a man named Clarence Kelly. And he had really done the yeoman work of sort of beginning to recalibrate the FBI for the post-Hoover era.
It's interesting because when you think of Hoover, and we don't, the topic doesn't come up here on the radio show very often, but I'm very much reminded with the name J. Edgar Hoover. You may not be, and I'll put this out there for everyone who may or may not know, but there was an incident here in Washington back in the 40s. It was called the Murray Island incident. And in that incident, there was allegedly these men in black that came out. But J. Edgar Hoover was the one that sent the guys out to go investigate what was going on at the Murray Island incident, which was, who knows if it was UFOs or what was actually in what took place. But it's always interesting to hear the name J. Edgar Hoover, and it always takes me back to something that I've done my research on in regards to an incident that happened close in here, which is just, I'm in West Seattle, so just west of me, a little bit over by Vashon Island, obviously the home of Mount Rainier and the Kenneth Arnold UFO sighting. So when people say Roswell, I always like to put this out there. Remember, in Washington, it happened here first. So we are, I always tell, like, we're the home for the most paranormal UFO sightings. But obviously, the incident something may have crashed over there. Kenneth Arnold saw the stuff here in 47 prior to the stuff in Roswell, I think later on in June or July or whatever that may be. But getting back to your story on a tangent, so my apologies there. But what's interesting to me when you think about the 60s, 69, a revolution of, this was the time when we're talking the separation of Caucasian kids, colored kids going to different schools, the water situation, African Americans had their own bathrooms, it just, things that we don't fathom to this day, the quality of life, it wasn't that long ago that these types of things were going on. It's startling to think that, I couldn't sit down to have dinner with somebody and that may have been some other descent other than, Caucasian, being someone who's, Italian, Hispanic, Mexican, American, a melting pot of, different ethnicities. It just blows my mind to think that, yes, there were segregation going on. And I know for a lot of people that live in the Pacific Northwest, I know you were talking about living up in your neck of the woods in Maine. Is that right? When you said you grew up?
I grew up in Maine.
Yeah. How the shelter of I don't know that there was a lot of that going on here back in those days, at least from what I've heard from others who grew up during that time. They said there wasn't a lot of that segregation going on here. So I don't know if you saw that when you were growing up, segregation.
Well, not really. It was the closest thing we had was, Native American reservations, not too far from where I lived. We didn't have a lot of Black people living in rural Maine for sure. But my parents, my mother was from New York and my father was from Cincinnati, and they'd gone back to the land in Maine. And so I grew up on a little homestead, with no electricity and an outhouse and a big gardens and a root cellar. So, yeah. And so they had participated in civil rights activity and brought those stories and that history into the home. And that's how I began to learn about it.
And that's interesting that that's cool that your parents brought that history back to share with you to continue the evolution of what they thought was the path to the correct path, obviously equality for everyone. Do you feel like in this book that you've done here, are there pieces that remind you of modern times right now?
Yeah. So for example, you were just showing video of that shooting on November 3rd, 1979. Mm-hmm. Pretty amazing, right? That there were four camera crews set up that day to cover it. And so we have this incredibly detailed visual record of what happened. And still no one was ever acquitted. But that, in a sense, that visual piece is part of what drew me to the story, because today we have cell phones, we have cameras everywhere. Everything seems to be captured on film. That was much rarer then. And to see how it then traveled through our judicial system, right? But, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, right? And so you can watch this happen and then create a whole different alternative narrative around what is in those pictures. and decide that what you see actually isn't the truth. And that's something that, we've been dealing with recently in a number of different, it seems to me, settings, but particularly, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, January 6th, 2021.
Wow.
Um,
I mean, yeah, 100%. It's interesting because you think about it, I'm like, wait, people died that day.
right.
There's not it. I always tell everyone, I mean, yeah, I do a conspiracy rated show. There's certain conspiracies we just don't cover. I don't cover 9/11. I don't really cover the conspiracy of, the coronavirus. There's, people dying. These are people that are dying. Now, I'm not an expert, and people are like, well, the blah blah blah. However that plays out, January 6th, another one. I don't subscribe to any type of garbage in regards to conspiracy in regards to that. When people die at mass quantities, and even the loss of life, it's not something you play with and toy with. And it's interesting because you are correct in that regards to that January 6th, and that was 4 years ago. That was 4 years ago. Can you imagine if that was the opposite? If those were all liberals that had stormed the Capitol, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I don't know that is going to be the case this year.
I don't think so.
Yeah,
but
I just don't know that's in their nature. It just, to me, the playbook in which took place on January 6th, and this will I always like to tell everyone that there was a gentleman who wrote a book called Behold the Pale Horse. William Cooper was a very extreme. And then when that whole group that came out, the QAnon group that had this huge movement, someone who's read the book back in 2000, such a long time ago, I was like, whoa, wait a second. This is all familiar. What is going on? And sure enough, it was a lot of what was going on was coming out of the book, Behold the Pale Horse. And the QAnon really made it like their Bible. And I was like, this is wild. This is wild. And in that fact that, to think that someone who had passed away, he, predicted his own death, but he had issues on his own. But for them to take this conspiracy book that was really off kilter, I mean, people going to, to these like realms of like concentration, modern day concentration camps, things of that nature.
Yeah.
That's how far off it was. So to think about the January 6th thing, I'll let you pick back up. But yeah, you're right. I mean, people died that day. I mean, a lot of, there was a loss of life, and who's being accountable? Who's being held accountable for that, for those actions? So.
Yeah, Mario, did you ever come across a guy named Harold Covington out there? He was he had something called the Northern Front, I think it was called. It was a sort of idea of an organization that he lived in Bremerton, Washington, and was basically advocating a white ethno-state. What's interesting, the reason I bring him up is he was the head of the American Nazi Party and was from North Carolina. And it was some of his men that showed up to the march and were shooting that day. And he then went out and reestablished himself in the Northwest. But I've always wondered, how he sort of escaped the law to some degree for so long, and I always wondered if maybe he'd been some sort of informant, but I don't know. Certainly unclear.
It's interesting that you think about that. Yeah. Could he have been a planted seed from the CIA, and then him being sent to the Northwest and especially Bremerton. I mean, there's not much going on out there. It's very rural. It's very, it is a very, now it's, it's been modernized, but there's still a lot of there's a lot of twigs in between, cities and townships and things of that nature. I mean, I'm very familiar with Bremerton. So putting him up in the shelf up here in the Pacific Northwest, a good hiding spot if he's a former informant of the CIA or FBI.
Yeah, one of the things that you ask about things that surprised me. Another one that surprised me was the degree to which the FBI had infiltrated the Klan in the late 60s and into the 70s. There were Klan claverns in North Carolina with 8 members, and 7 of them were informants. So you had informants informing on informants. And so, when that was one of the things the church committee in the mid 70s was really looking at, was how informants were used and whether they were being used to really prevent violence or to exacerbate violence in some cases. And that was what they tried to do, was after that, limit the way that informants would be used, and make it much harder to sort of set up an informant network. And that's one of the things that the FBI wanted loosened so that they could use informants more liberally again after Greensboro. And so what they would say was, well, if we'd had an informant, we could have prevented the violence in Greensboro in 1979. And they were able to use that to get those restrictions loosened so they could use informants again, more like as they had under Hoover. But the problem with that argument was that the police informant had been an FBI informant for a long time and had actually told his FBI handlers everything he told the Greensboro Police Department. So they knew, but unofficially. And so there were 3 law enforcement outfits: the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the FBI, and the Greensboro Police Department, that could have prevented the violence that day and didn't.
Oh, man. You would think that protect and serve, regardless, protect and serve. Our guest this evening, Aran Shetterly, has a website, aranshetterly.com. His book available on his website, Morningside, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre and the Struggle for an American City Soul. Aran, I got to ask you, and I don't have to ask you, but I'm going to ask you, in all the times that you sit and chat about this story, and all the stuff you've done, this one and all your other books, do you feel like this one took a lot out of you in regards to research, like a little bit of the, resistance? Do you feel like this one took it out? That this one was a big project, like striving for, and you're like, wow, my baby finally grew up, and I'm like, wow, I mean, it was a hard one.
It was a hard one. There's no question, Mario. It's
like your second child, right? You're like the middle one.
Yeah, it was hard. It was hard to sit with a lot of this stuff for so long. And it's one of the reasons it took so long, because I had to figure out, what did I really believe and what did I really think? Especially when there's such passionate people on different sides of this telling me, what they believed and why it was right. And so it took me a long time to sort of sort through the material and, go over it again and make sure that I was writing something that I felt was true and not just parroting, someone's point of view. But at the end of the day, I feel like I accomplished that and told this sort of complicated, roiling tale of, our country and how hard it is, and sometimes, to escape from our own history, escape from ourselves and our own limitations. But I'm encouraged by the people who keep trying, and they're the ones that kept me going through this.
And the different characters in the book, as you said, you wrote the characters, the members from the Klan. Were you able to have conversations with them?
No.
Or was it more of a story?
What's interesting is most of them are no longer alive. They lived hard. They didn't live as long as some of the other people.
Sure.
But also, when I tried to get in touch with family members, they really didn't want to talk about it. And so, but there was so much legal material, so much newspaper article material, so many good interviews from that time that I still felt like I was able to represent their point of view and get into their heads pretty well from what was available to me.
And when you said these families didn't want to chat, was it because they were like, they wanted to move past that piece of history? Like it was not, they weren't proud of that piece? Or was it more like they were ashamed? What were you getting from the resistance in regards to them not wanting to talk?
I sensed that they felt there was no benefit to talking, that it was hard, shameful. You know, what good could come of dredging that up for them and their families? That was my sense.
Sure.
I didn't get close enough to be able to ask that question and let them answer it, but yeah, that's what I felt.
You would think, yeah. I mean, being tied to someone's last name, someone who may be a clan member or something that may be shameful. I shouldn't say a clan member because maybe not all of them are bad, but who knows? There's got to be good in everybody, I'm assuming. But
let me pick up on that for a second,
Sure.
Mario, because that was something I did not want to create, one-dimensional characters in this book. And part of that came from the Johnsons, Nelson and Joyce Johnson. And they said, we believe in the dignity of every human being, and that every human being has the potential for good. And I really tried to represent that with every single character that I could in this book, and make them fully human. Like I wasn't interested in just, setting up, easy bad guys and good guys. And so, I think there's a lot of nuance in this book that people will, I leave it up to the reader to figure out often how they feel about the different characters.
Man, in I think 46 years of my life, I mean, it was something that came across and I was like, wait, how am I not informed? And I felt like a complete idiot, someone who loves history, good and bad and different. I'd love to learn about the country, the modern day of what was going on, the growth of the country, where we were at during these times. So we don't go back. I think that in a younger society, I know there is a really young group of individuals who are growing up right now, who are coming into their own voting rights wise, things of that nature. But we have to remember, regardless if you're a Republican or a Democrat or however you lean, whichever way of the fence, it is most important that we understand the American history, where we've been and where we're going, so that we can understand and continue to grow, evolve as a country. And Aaron, I have to say, I appreciate you being able to take a 7-year long project, put it to paper, and be able to provide a little piece of history that's probably not the sexiest piece of history in American history, but to be able to give us almost kind of an overview, like a 200-foot overview of what happened, with giving us the ability to learn some of these characters and kind of like go through that process with them during your journey in this book. What other projects are you working on right now outside of what, promoting the book and, talking about this event that took place in 1979?
Well, I'm, really, the book just came out less than a month ago. So it's been a pretty, full court press on that for now. And I've been traveling a lot and doing book events, which has been really interesting. I mean, I've met a lot of interesting people with connections to this history. And also, I would just say, part of the reason I wrote the book and about this specifically wasn't only that Greensboro is an important place in the country, which it is, and I think is often overlooked, but that everywhere in this country has difficult history that, it could spend some time thinking about and trying to understand and more deeply understand one's own place because of it, is what I thought. And there's a way in which Greensboro provides a model for that, because they ended up going through a truth and reconciliation process in Greensboro to try to understand what had happened in 1979. And I think that that was a courageous thing to do, instead of just sweeping it under the rug. But to your point, Mario, I lived in Cuba for 6 months. I've lived in Costa Rica. I've lived in Mexico for almost 11 years. Latin America is near and dear to me. And so I'm planning to write my next book, and I hope it will take much less time than this one did, about Mexico.
And when you lived in Cuba, because I know a lot of us have not been to Cuba, what was the best part? What did you love about Cuba the most? Was it still under Fidel at that point when you were there?
Fidel was still alive when I was there. Yep. Okay. And but what I loved was the people. They were just wonderful. So many wonderful people. And one of the things, through all the hardship that they were living through there, they were, in general, quite well educated. And you could have an interesting conversation with just about any Cuban anywhere in that country. And that was pretty fascinating. Now, I had some really interesting experiences there. So, for example, I was there when George W. Bush was president, and said that one 4th of July, and I happened to be there then, that any Cuban who could just get to the international line in the ocean would be picked up by Coast Guard and brought to the United States. Now, I was living in this nice little section of the city and had a lot of neighbors who were claimed to be very pro-revolution. But when this happened, all of a sudden, they started asking me in for coffee in the privacy of their homes to ask me what I thought about this and whether they should try to get to the international water line. And it gave me a real insight into what was going on there.
It's interesting that you say that. It's, maybe one day we'll have the opportunity to, I know during the Obama administration, there were a few that, took the liberties to try to get to Cuba and travel and whatnot. It's interesting when you look at the pictures, and it's almost like someone took a stopwatch and just stopped time in regards to vehicles and things of that nature. I'm sure that's not still the case these days, but interesting that you said that. I have to go back and look. I don't recall. Was there an influx back then? I don't recall that making headlines.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't make any. Yeah. No. And in fact, what happened was the next day, I was walking down. It's called the Malecon, which is the famous seawall along the edge of Havana, and I noticed that I was the only one walking there. It was very strange.
Sure.
And because usually it's crowded and bustling, and there are people, selling things and talking to you and swimming and fishing. And I suddenly noticed I was all alone. And I looked, and there was a cop every 30 feet. And apparently there were cops all along the coast trying to prevent people from going out, and successfully.
So, you're staying here. You're not going anywhere.
Yeah, they knew I wasn't going to suddenly jump in a boat and head off back to the international water line. So they let me walk along there, but there were no Cubans there.
Oh, that's interesting times. Yeah. I was thinking about this as we were having a conversation about the Cuba piece. When you were writing this book, and what brought this to my attention was the TV stations that were there reporting. I know that were you able to find anybody from these stations that were still alive to share their insight?
Yeah, I had a wonderful conversation with a cameraman named Ed Boyd.
Cameramen, they're always good. They always give a good insight.
He's an African-American guy, cameraman. He'd been in the, I think it was the Air Force, and then had trained to be a cameraman and just loved it. I mean, he ended up in the perfect spot. He had a go bag, and he loved just jumping in the car and going to the next shoot and filming. And so he spent a long time telling me his story, and he thought, he watched this, he at one point dropped his camera because he thought a gun was being aimed at him, and then he jumped in the car he'd come in and kept filming. And what he described in his mind was he thought it was a military operation, essentially, that the Klan and Nazis had run there, that they knew exactly what they were doing. They had fired a shot in the air to scare the activists back toward the real shooters, and that the real shooters had then, taken the guns out of the trunk of the car and picked off people. So it was a very interesting conversation to have with him in what he saw in front of him as something that he thought looked very well planned.
Interesting. I mean, when you're sitting there and you're looking at things from a different eye, and most photographers are trying to look for what could possibly be the best shot, and someone who has been in the media business, I mean, if it leads, it leads, but I'm not sure that he was looking for that. But that's an interesting take that you share with us here this evening on the show. I mean, was that, do you think that was what the case was? That it was it provoked by the Klan? Was it like, what was the tip off for most of like this whole, was it like a warning shot that triggered the entire thing to go down for someone who's never listened to never heard the story before? Was that the case where it was a...
Yeah. So what Ed Boyd picked up in his camera, which is to me extremely telling, although it didn't play out in the courts this way for various reasons, but what you can see as the caravan is driving up, there's a young man loading what is a powder pistol before anything has happened. And then some sort of shouting and some, couple cars get kicked a little bit. But he then stands out of the pickup truck he's in and shoots this powder pistol into the air that creates this plume of dark smoke. And that was the signal, it seems, perhaps, to start a fight. Now, the defense attorneys later said this was a friendly warning shot to tell people to stand down, to not fight, to scare them away so they wouldn't fight. That just doesn't seem to really make sense when you're in it.
Sure. Our guest this evening, Aran Shetterly. From his website, you can go and purchase his book at aranshetterly.com. Our guest this evening, as we wrap things up close to the top of the hour here from the Pacific Northwest. Aran, I gotta say thank you for coming to hang out with us. Anything else that you want? Let's wrap this up, put a bow on this. So we're saying that the country right now, we're better off than we were in regard. I kid, but in this piece here, do you feel that after 7 years writing this book, going through the entire thing here, this piece of history will go down as a divide in the line where I mean, I'm trying, like, is this like the 69 type of situation? Was this like the dissolving of the Klan? Was this more of like the evolution of marches? What did we learn here?
I think, to be honest with you, Mario, I think it is a detonating moment for the alt-right and for white power. I think because no one was held accountable, that there was a sense of impunity and empowerment, and that people thought, wow, the culture really supports us to some degree. So I think in that case, this event is truly significant. I think it's also significant because it, essentially puts an end to the ultra left. It's terrifying. The, sort of homegrown communist movement is ended by this to some degree. And I think it also leads to, a sort of more empowerment in a way, complicated empowerment of law enforcement that we need to keep thinking about, is, do we want more transparency or less transparency? And I think that that's something that is an ongoing conversation.
Our guest tonight, Aran Shetterly, from his own website, aranshetterly.com. We'll have all the links provided. If you'd like to get a copy of his book, you can do so by going to our website or going to the podcast link. Go to your favorite podcasting platform and search U.S. Phenomenon with Mario Magana. The Massacre, the Morningside, his book is called The Morningside, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre and the Struggle for an American City's Soul. Again, our guest, author Aran Shetterly, thank you so much for hanging out with us this evening. As we wrap up things from the Pacific Northwest, I'd like to thank our guest, Aran Shetterly, for taking the time this evening to chat with us. For my entire crew, Mark Christopher, Jeff Jens, and Sophia Magana, and myself, Mario Magana, be sure to look up at the sky, because you never know what you might see. Good night.